Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, Episode 39.
The Lizzie Borden Podcast is sponsored by Belanger Books, featuring all new adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Solar Ponds, Carnacki the Ghost Finder, and occult detectives from the pulp era to the 21st century. From Lovecraftian horror to the wondrous worlds of H.G. Wells, Belanger Books has it all. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com.
I am your host, Stephanie Corey, filling in for the late Richard Behrens, author of the Lizzie Borden Girl Detective series of mysteries. The Lizzie Borden Podcast is the only podcast entirely devoted to the study of the Borden murders of 1892, Lizzie Borden, and the world that shaped her, Fall River, Massachusetts, and beyond. Produced by Nine Muses Books and Anna Behrens, the podcast explores the many facets of the case, the crime, the culture, the courtroom drama, and Lizzie's lasting impact on popular imagination. From nursery rhymes and trial transcripts to fictional retellings and forgotten histories, each episode may uncover a new angle on the case that never quite closed. I am joined today by Dr. C. Michael Hiam, author of Murder Aboard, The Herbert Fuller Tragedy, and the Ordeal of Thomas Bram, a gripping new work of historical true crime. This maritime mystery unfolded off the coast of Massachusetts just 3 years after the trial of Lizzie Borden and invoked startling parallels to the Borden case. And now, the Lizzie Borden Podcast presents The Herbert Fuller Tragedy and the Lizzie Borden Connection. Welcome to the Lizzie Borden Podcast. Today's episode takes us out to sea, literally, to explore a haunting murder case that unfolded aboard a ship off the coast of Massachusetts in 1896. Our guest is Dr. C. Michael Hiam, author of Murder Aboard, The Herbert Fuller Tragedy, and the Ordeal of Thomas Bram, a gripping new work of historical true crime. Michael is a clinical psychologist in private practice and a native Bostonian, which he says isn't everything, it's the only thing. His Boston roots and lifelong fascination with history have led him to write 3 acclaimed works of nonfiction: Dirigible Dreams, The Age of the Airship, A Moment to Deceit, Sam Adams and the Vietnam Intelligence Wars, and Eddie Shore and That Old-Time Hockey. Murder Aboard marks his first foray into true crime, and what a case to begin with. This maritime mystery unfolds only a few years after the Borden murders, and intriguingly, the prosecution in the Herbert Fuller trial actually invoked the Lizzie Borden case in court, claiming incorrectly that the judge had allowed testimony about Lizzie's alleged purchase of prussic acid because it showed intent to kill. In reality, as we all know, that evidence was excluded at trial. So today, we'll talk with Michael about how this remarkable seaborne murder case intersected both legally and culturally with one of the most famous criminal trials in American history. Welcome, Michael.
Oh, it's good to be here.
I came across the Herbert Fuller tragedy through my work in the Borden case, particularly in Edmund Pearson's writings, which he links both stories in his own way. When I read your book, Murder Aboard, I was struck not only by the depth of your research, but also by how fresh and immediate your narrative feels, even though the events happened more than a century ago. So I'd love to start talking about how you discovered this case and what led you to bring to life it in such a compelling way. Can you begin by explaining to the listener a bit about the story of the Herbert Fuller murders?
Yes. So how I came to this story is I had finished 3, as you mentioned, nonfiction works, and I was a little bit adrift. I wanted to do one more and then, return full-time to psychology. And then if I do a 5th book, it's going to be in my retirement year. So searching around I wanted to do true crime. I wanted a story that wasn't going to take 20 years of research. Originally was thinking of another crime. that occurred in Boston, the Webster Parker murder. There've been books on that, and I had nothing to add. And so the same book you were reading by Lester Pearson, his collection of true crime stories. I ran across the Herbert Fuller murders, and amazingly enough, no one had written about this. I thought, okay, well, maybe a book was written back in 1932, but it's out of date and I can refresh it. But there really wasn't any book. There was, chapters here and there, and collections of true crime. So what you do is, as a nonfiction writer, what I do is I take an inductive approach. This is interesting. I want to get to know more about it. And there weren't many secondary sources. So I went into the microfiche room at Boston Public Library and began looking at old newspapers. That's just a treasure trove, and they are not digitalized. You got to actually go to the librarian and pull out the microfiche for the Boston transcript, April to June 1896 or whatever, and scroll through. And fortunately for this case, it was enormously followed case in Boston. And the newspaper coverage, principally the Boston Globe. Boston at the time had about 5, 6, 7 other newspapers, but the Boston Globe followed it the most diligently. I followed, for the most part, the Globe's reportage when the case was first known. In those days, Lizzie Borden as well, I believe the same thing, is that we didn't have a national media. And really interesting, fascinating events. They really stayed local and regional. So if it wasn't like the assassination of a president, it didn't, really the rest of the world wouldn't necessarily know what was going on in New England. So I don't know. Did that answer some of your question?
Yes, it did. How did you hear about the Herbert Fuller to begin with to think, oh, I'm interested in that?
So it was just that reading Pearson's book.
Oh, Pearson. Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Pearson. Edmund Lester Pearson. So he came out with this book in 1928, and the Borden case was in it.
Yes, Studies in Murder.
And up until then, that Borden case had been kind of forgotten about, and
Exactly.
He's the one who ignited the national interest in it, which exists to today.
Mm-hmm.
And there were many other really interesting cases, but the Herbert Fuller case that didn't gain national traction
Right.
So that was like, okay, cool. This is really interesting.
Well, not only is an interesting story, but it has an ending that's unusual, I think. And
yeah, it does.
Not
Yeah.
It ends, but it doesn't end. So
it doesn't.
It has implications.
It
So
does.
the case spans oceans and involves a wide range of people, from crewmen to diplomats to Canadian authorities to American prosecutors and defense attorneys. How did you approach gathering your sources besides using the newspapers, and what were some of the most challenging records to track down? I understand some portions of the second trial are lost forever.
Yeah, there really wasn't, except for, as I say, Pearson's book in that chapter. There's a lot of other, snippets in other books, but they all follow Pearson.
The Green Bag, which is
Grinnell.
like a journal by Grinnell in 1897.
Yeah, so the Green Bag, as I understand it, it wasn't like it wasn't a law review journal. It was like an entertainment journal for lawyers.
Yeah, exactly.
And so Grinnell, he wrote an entertaining piece, which Pearson, I believe, really based his opinions on that really short article, which is fine. So we have Grinnell's highly biased view of, who was really antagonistic towards one of the defendant, Thomas Bram. And so then Pearson echoed that, and then that's been echoed for a century since, which is fine. To talk a little bit briefly about one of the reason why it really struck me is it was the weirdness of what happened. The essential story in a nutshell is in July 3, 1996, the Herbert Fuller, that's essentially a type of schooner, or it's a close cousin to a schooner, a small sailing ship carrying pine boards from Boston to Rosario, Argentina, leaves Long Wharf in Boston with 10 souls aboard. The ship anchors at the anchorage in Boston Harbor because the prevailing sailing winds are not suitable for beginning the sail, but then finally set sail on July 8th. So it's an interesting mix of characters on board. You have the captain, Charles Nash, and his wife, Laura Nash, both from Harrington, Maine, down east. And they're both solid citizens from seafaring families. And Charles Nash's father actually had owned the shipyard where the Herbert Fuller was built. So the captain, some years before, actually supervised the building of the ship, making sure that the accommodations for himself and his wife were as comfortable as possible because they didn't have children, and she accompanied him on his sea voyages. There was the first mate, Thomas Bram, who ended up being the defendant. He was of mixed race from St. Kitts in the Caribbean. The second mate was a man named August Bloomberg. He was from Finland. There was a so-called colored steward, Jonathan Spencer. He was age 24 from St. Vincent. And then we have six deckhands, common sailors. They didn't know each other prior to the voyage. They'd only been hired the day before. One of them was Dutch, one of them was German. There were three Swedes, and all of them are in their early to mid 20s, except the eldest one, also Swedish, was Charles Brown, who was 30. They didn't all speak English, they didn't all speak the same language, but they seemed to get along well with each other. Then the last person aboard was Lester Hawthorne Monks. He's aged 20. He's from Brookline, Massachusetts. I think now we would describe him as kind of a dweeb. He was a Harvard student. He had just ended his second year at Harvard. His grades were terrible. He skipped his final exams. They were all C's, and so he was probably bound to flunk out. He had health problems. Don't know exactly what they were, but there was nothing sinister. I don't think there's anything that anyone was hiding. He had general poor health. Had been in a bicycle accident, and an uncle of his suggested that a seagoing voyage would be good for his health. And his intention was to be on the Herbert Fuller, and then when it got to Buenos Aires, to get off and then take a steamer to Europe and spend a year there, and then come home and decide what his next steps in life were. Obviously, I could say that he was from a wealthy family. Mm-hmm. So they leave on the 8th, and they're headed again for Argentina with this bring pine lumber. Things are fine. Everything's harmonious. There's nothing unusual that anyone can remember afterwards. Then what happens, though, is that on the night of around 1 p.m. on the morning of July 11th, so they've been out several days, young Monks, a Harvard student, is in his cabin. There were
1 a.m., right? You said 1
a.m. Yes, that's correct. Yeah. And so it's important to note that in sailing ships of yore, there are two compartments housing people. In the forward part of the ship, there's called, in this case, the forehouse, sometimes it's called the forecastle. That's where the sailors live, and that's their abode. And then in the back of the ship, the stern, there's the after house, and that's where officers and privileged people live. So that's going to be where Captain Nash and his wife live. It's where, of course, where Monk is invited to be. And both mates Bram and Bloomberg are there also. So on the early morning of July 11th, young Monks is in his bunk, and he hears a scream, and he gets up, and he has a revolver that he's brought with him, which probably wasn't unusual in those days. I don't read anything sinister into that. He's going internationally traveling. And so he gets up, he brings out his revolver. There's been a scream. He goes out and he sees the captain usually slept in Monks's small bunk room, but he gave that up to sleep on a cot in the adjoining chart room. Monk sees the captain. He's tipped over from his cot, and Monk believes he's been killed. He goes up on deck, and he yells, and he sees Bram, who's, as the first officer, is on duty on deck at that early hour, and startles Bram and says, "Come below, the captain has been killed." And Bram and Monks go down. Bram to retrieve his revolver from his small room, and Monks, because he wants to change out of his pajamas to get into a shirt and pants and shoes. And they, oddly enough, don't check on the captain or any of the other occupants of the afterhouse. So they don't check on Bloomberg, who is supposedly asleep in his room, and they don't check on Mrs. Nash, who's supposedly asleep in her room. They go up on deck. They think that the crew has mutinied against them. So they both have their revolvers. They go topside around the middle of the deck and hunker down because they're waiting for the mutineers to come attack them. Nothing happens. The hours pass, nice and peaceful. There's the helmsman in the stern, and he's steering the ship, and he doesn't notice that these two guys are there. And then there's somebody up front in the bow of the ship who is who's on watch, and all is fine. And so, a couple hours pass. Bram and Monks go up to the forward house and knock on the door of the colored steward, Spencer, who comes out in just like pants. And they say, the captain has been killed. And Spencer thinks they're joking. He says, well, I guess not. And they say, no, come look. So the three of them go back. Steward Spencer goes down and comes up immediately and says that the second mate, Bloomberg, has been killed, and he's dead in his cabin. So now all three of them are convinced that that there's a mutiny taking place. When Spencer comes up and says that Bloomberg has been killed, apparently by an axe, Bram suddenly shouts and says, "There's the axe that does it," and points out 10 feet away, and there's a bloodied axe on the deck. And Spencer and Monks are saying, "Okay, well, let's preserve it for analysis. That Bram, who pointed out the axe, was the first one to get it, and he yells and throws it into the murder weapon, which it was, into the ocean, saying afterwards, well, if there's a mutiny, the sailors could use it against us." So after that odd episode, they all go up to the forward house where there's two sailors on deck on watch and then on duty, and then there's four below, presumably sleeping, and they then collect all six sailors, interrogate them. They profess to know nothing about the murders. There's no mutiny taking place, and so now the whole crew of the survivors goes aft, and they go into the afterhouse and discover that Bloomberg has been killed by an axe. The captain, who was also killed by an axe, which Monk didn't know. He thought the captain was dead, had been killed, but didn't know how. And that Mrs. Nash in her room had been killed by an axe. So what to do? They brought the bodies out of the afterhouse, respectfully, the three bodies, sewed them up in canvas, put them in what's called the longboat, that's sort of a utility boat that the Herbert Fuller had, and then covered it up with tar to preserve the bodies for proper burial back at home. And Monks at this point felt compelled to write an account of the tragedy. So Monks, he wasn't a very good student, not a good speller, so he writes out on some pieces of paper his account of what happened. He woke up, he heard a scream, he saw Bram. And then Monks had this really, he ends this brief account, which is actually in the Boston Athenaeum. So that was nice. I did have the actual pages, one of the very few surviving documents from the tragedy. So Monks writes out this kind of misspelled, but sort of generally a timeline of waking up and seeing the axe being thrown overboard, etc. But then Monks, his final theory, which got him into trouble later on, was like this crazy thought that Captain Nash, Bloomberg, the second mate, the person who was killed, was attempting to rape Mrs. Nash. Captain Nash heard this, grabbed the axe. The axe was an emergency axe that was was in the afterhouse for cases of having to break through a door, things, that kind of stuff. Gets the axe, according to Monks, the captain gets the axe, attacks Bloomberg, but also the captain attacks his wife, Mrs. Nash. He kills Mrs. Nash. He wounds Bloomberg severely, but Bloomberg grabs the axe and then kills Captain Nash. Bloomberg, severely injured, goes up on deck, drops the axe on deck, goes back into his cabin and dies. And when Monks was asked to tell his story again in court, or 9 months afterwards, the courtroom just burst into laughter. It was so absurd. But again, I don't describe any conspiracy on Monks's part. I just think this is a young man thrust into a completely unexpected hellish situation, and this is just his kind of not being able to comprehend what happened. So I don't. So for the following day, they discover the bodies. There's the burial in the longboat. The crew, the survivors, like no one knows, like somebody among them is a murderer, that's for sure. They don't know it, so they're all suspicious of each other. They search the whole ship for any more clues they can find. They can't find any. So that evening, the people who've taken charge of the ship now are Bram, which is rightfully his because he's the first mate, Monks because of his Harvard status, and also Spencer, who is a very lively guy and sort of is a natural leader, and he's not part of the sailing crew. He has his own status. Bram, Monks, and Spencer take control of the ship and place all of the sailors up deck, and the sailors need to sleep up deck at night, and the three of them can watch them. Meanwhile, the decision is made not to try to go to Argentina, but to turn around. And because of the sailing conditions and the trade winds, Halifax, Nova Scotia turns out. Graham figures out, he has navigational skills, of course, that this is the best place to go. The night after the murders is peaceful. The next day is peaceful. So 2 days after the murders, and one of the sailors comes up to Bram and says that Charlie Brown, the Swedish sailor, the oldest sailor at age 30, had talked before about a mutiny and had been acting very strangely as if he wanted to jump overboard. They decide, Bram, Monks, and Spencer, that Brown probably did it, and so they clasp him in irons and put him in captivity for the rest of the time. 2 or 3 days elapse, as they're sailing again with no events to Halifax. And one day before they're to arrive in Halifax, Spencer has Bram clasped in iron and put into captivity. Bram is shocked, and Spencer said, "You're the first mate, and you had to have known about this. You had to be in on it." So when the Herbert Fuller sails into Halifax, there are two murder suspects aboard, and the Halifax authorities take over and they put everybody in detention, which would make sense, while they conduct their investigation. So there's much more to say, but I don't want to. I also want people to read the book.
Right, but this is a case that, because it occurred in the open sea,
Yes,
it's not a state case, a murder case. It is a federal case.
yes, what it is that it's a Canadian case for a certain respect, but ultimately international law, because it was an American flag ship and which was owned and run by Americans, it becomes the United States case. So the United States takes over the case.
So the circuit court takes over the case in Boston, and we have a United States District Attorney, Sherman Hoare,
Yes,
becomes
correct.
the prosecutor.
Yep.
And the defense attorneys are James Cotter and Asa French.
Yeah, really, yeah.
They work
Yeah.
for Bram, who ends up getting accused and indicted for
Yes.
the crime. And the trial starts December 14th, 1896. And then he is, just to shorten it up, Bram is convicted. They take a while to come to that conclusion.
Yeah. So the crutch of the case is that there are two suspects.
Right.
And like race plays a part, there's no question.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And but I don't want to overplay that, but I also want to say that yes, that is a factor. So there are two suspects. One is this Charlie Brown guy. He's Swedish. Apparently, his English isn't good, but he comes across as, a really, a down to earth kind of a sailor kind of guy. Just so trustworthy and
trustworthy. Isn't he the
yeah.
liar? Isn't he like famous
I
for
think
his
he
lies?
might be. I think he might be. So Hoare has to decide, well, who do I can't, there's no evidence that Bram and Brown had any sort of conspiracy. That there's not a
Right.
shred of it. Not then and not now. So Hoare has to decide, I need to make one of these the defendant, and the other one, to spare their lives, the chief witness against the defendant. He chooses Bram to be the defendant, and he chooses Brown to be the chief witness against Bram.
Right.
During the trial, Brown is not a very intelligent person, And at one point, he strayed from the scripted testimony that Hoare wanted him to do.
Yeah.
So even though Brown wasn't been accused of anything, he's just being held in detention, which makes sense, right? You don't want your chief witness, and these guys are sailors. They don't really have any identity that people can, you can't track them. So they can easily just go on a ship and be gone forever. So Brown, who's in detention in a hotel room, taken to solitary confinement in a jail because Brown had not really followed the testimony, the script that he was supposed to follow. And that gave Brown a certain time to sort of reflect about, let's make sure our testimony tomorrow is what Hoare wants. So there was that kind of stuff throughout the trial.
So the first time he's found guilty, and then the sentence is hanging, death.
Yeah.
That's for this federal crime. And then there's an appeal to the Supreme Court. We won't go into the details of that, but there was an appeal to the Supreme Court based on some testimony or some statements that Bram had made in Canada to the investigator, which was incriminating himself, but sort of, but it was under duress. So that testimony was thrown out, and a new trial was ordered. And then, but the law had changed since then so that you could be guilty without capital punishment.
Correct. Yes.
And so it seemed like a compromise that the jury liked, and they went that way. And so Bram gets sent to Atlanta to the U.S. penitentiary, but then he's paroled in 1913 and given a full pardon by President Wilson in 1919. And he's all excited about that. See, I wasn't guilty after all. So, but the story doesn't really end there. It's interesting because there's another book on the case called Not a Gentleman's Work by Gerard Keppel. Yeah. He places the blame on monks as the person who probably did it. But your book focuses on Charlie Brown, who's got this history of mental illness.
He does, an attempted murder in the past.
And kind of irrational behavior where he loses reality,
becomes paranoid,
and loses his check on reality, and can black out for days at a time and then come back and then told what he's done and things like that. So you picked him as probably the one who did it, right?
Yeah, definitely. So, but just want to just back up for one minute about the trials. And I think we can be proud of Boston that, this was over 100 years ago. Bram had no money. And so the judge, I don't know which one, assigned him court-ordered attorney. So Bram had excellent attorneys. He had Cotter, and Cotter was a hard scrabble kind of attorney. He was from Ireland, had a lot of success in criminal defense. And, he was really a fine attorney, lots of courtroom experience. And then his younger attorney,
Asa French.
Asa French was born of good New England family, and he was from the North Shore. And Asa French, to show how competent he was, later on became DA for Boston.
Oh,
so
cool.
he was, so he was they were a very effective and did extremely good job. So Bram got the best possible,
really good attorneys.
And it was a long trial and everything.
What surprised you most about the social or cultural context of the 1890s that you wrote in, and how they shaped the murders and how they were investigated and judged? I mean, I've done a lot of reading, of course, about
I can imagine,
but this is a federal case, and it's a different scenario.
Yeah, it is different. So, and so then when the first trial after Monks was sentenced to death, which was normal in those times, and now those times.
Bram was
I apologize. Yeah, Bram was that was a Freudian slip there.
It is a Freudian slip. Yep.
It should have been somebody else. The judge immediately granted an appeal. Then the appeal went to the Supreme Court, as you noted. And I sent the Supreme Court proceedings to my late uncle, who was a very prominent attorney. And my uncle's take was that this was a Supreme Court that was highly sympathetic to the defendant, thinking that he'd been wrongly convicted, and we're just looking for any excuse to overturn his conviction.
Definitely.
So the overturn was basically, it was like a Miranda rights, essentially.
Exactly.
Sort of thing.
Yeah.
It was highly technical. My uncle's point was, no, this was they had already made the judgment that he needed to go back to trial, but we're searching for a reason to do it. So
you kind of insinuate that Hoare was a really good man, but had his prejudices, had his bigotry,
he
and
did have
that
his bigotry, yeah.
he lighted upon Bram as the killer because of his biracial
Yeah, yeah. He was the
appearance
less,
and his
yeah,
background. He was the
yeah.
less, yeah,
He was a less attractive. And Bram, I'm a psychologist, and Bram was a weird guy. He had a big issues about his racial identity that were just kind of absurd, and
right.
people really respected him. And that he'd go on that he really was white, and they they like, oh, okay, we can't really talk to Bram about this. He was well liked, well respected, but a strange guy. He went by all kinds of different names. He
Right.
gave himself different backgrounds, that he
He had
was
a strange
Irish.
relationship with his wife, an
Exactly so.
estranged
Yeah,
relationship with his wife too.
exactly so.
He
Yeah,
was very religious. He
yeah.
was an odd duck. He
He's an
definitely
odd duck, but again, you're allowed to be an odd duck. There's no law against it,
yeah, you
and
don't. An odd duck doesn't mean you kill people. That's right.
exactly. So, Hoare was a very ambitious. He had been a congressman for one term. He personally prosecuted the case. DAs personally prosecute cases when that are high profile and that they want to be in the
Mm-hmm.
public eye. He had further political ambitions and quite tragically died doing the right thing. He was volunteering down south shortly after the Spanish-American War and was helping with wounded soldiers from Massachusetts and caught some kind of disease and down there and died.
So you've got this sort of racial overtone to the
Yeah,
story,
yep,
but you
for
also
sure.
have a class issue with the
Yes,
story, and also
yeah.
foreigners. Now, Brom had been naturalized, so he was a naturalized citizen of the United States, and that's one of the
And
reasons
also
why.
Bloomberg as well. Yes,
Right.
they both have. Yeah,
So they were Americans,
correct. Yeah,
but not by birth, and everybody
yeah.
else was from everywhere else. I
Oh,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
and yet nobody looked at Monks because of his family, his reputation, his family's
Mm,
reputation, his family money, his family, he was of a higher class than anybody else
yeah.
on the boat. And so he was not regarded as someone to look at, even though there's every indication that his story is suspect also.
He was a sickly college kid who was on, he's beyond suspicion. He's a sickly college kid. He was on this voyage for his health.
Couldn't
He
that
was
have been a euphemism for being sort of an alcoholic and a ne'er-do-well?
maybe later on, but during at that it's so interesting. So he did bring a lot of alcohol with him on the boat, which you did in those days. But there's no one has ever suggested he was drunk. And the defense attorneys Carter and Finch eviscerated Monk on the stand. They let him have it at one point. I put this in my book because it really wasn't clear because of the garbled nature of some of the transcript. It seemed that they were implying that Monk's, when he was at Harvard, lived in Cambridge with a black a rooming house person, and they were indicating that maybe he had relationships with her. They were indicating that maybe he was on the trip because he suffered from a venereal disease.
Oh,
I mean,
right,
they
right.
they let him have it. So if there's one scintilla of evidence that Monks had been drinking, they would have brought that up, but there never was.
Mm-hmm.
But as a side sort of footnote, I didn't guess, but there was quite a bit of drinking on the trip. Monks at one point thought he thought that the captain was drunk. There was a sort of strange interaction the night of the murders between
Brom and
uh,
the captain, yeah.
Bloomberg and Bram about drinking. And so I don't know what to make of that. So if I can't make anything of it and it's not prominent, that just becomes sort of a distraction. But so one thing about Monks and his privilege, when they sailed into Halifax Harbor, the rest of the crew was sent to the
Mm-hmm.
city jail.
Mm-hmm.
Monks, because of his position,
Mm-hmm.
was still detained, but he was allowed to sleep in the chief of police's apartment in
Mm-hmm.
the police department. Now he was guarded, but he was given better preferential treatment. Monks's father, upon hearing that his son was in Halifax, immediately went to Halifax, hired a local attorney, and what that attorney did, the Halifax attorney, was memorialize Monk's version of events.
Mm-hmm.
so in history, like if you can get in there and get your narrative in first, that's a good thing.
Right, but he's the only
So
one with a lawyer, right?
he's
Everybody
alone
else.
with the lawyer, but also
Right.
it becomes kind of a star chamber because
Hmm.
he's with the lawyer and with the chief of police and his father and U.S. commissioner in Halifax. So it's a bit of a star chamber where they really
Mm.
at that point blame Bram. And so what Monks and his father and his lawyer did is that they established, memorialized the narrative,
Right.
which then Hoare takes. Hoare takes that,
Hmm.
and
He
that's
uses
Hoare
it, yeah.
goes uses it.
Well, Hoare tries to get some evidence into the trial about mate Brahms' past sailing experiences as a mate and a captain. And he uses the Lizzie Borden case as a precedent. And
Uh-huh.
oddly, he cites the case wrongly when he says that prussic acid
Yeah,
testimony was
I
allowed
followed
in the
that. Yeah,
Borden case when it was in fact disallowed.
yeah, I
Such
checked that. That's so interesting. Yeah, I
such
checked that.
errors
Yeah,
of legal argument startled me, especially when the defense did not object.
yeah.
And the trial had been just a few years before and was very famously known around Massachusetts. Was there anything in the official trial transcript that elaborated on this gaffe? And is there
I didn't. Yeah,
such a misstatement of common law in this
yeah.
case?
So the trial transcript again, that's just going to be the transcript. So when I began my book, so French at some point had a copy of the first trial transcript and donated that to Harvard Law, that was his alumni matter. And but then when I contacted Harvard Law again, I don't describe. They said no, it was lost. So that actually, I'm kind of glad I didn't have that because I relied on Boston Globe principally and the Herald, and they were what happened was there'd be the trial day, and it'd be transcribed all day. Then at the end of the day, the transcription would be prepared for journalists, and then journalists who'd been in the courtroom that day, must have been exhausting,
Mhm.
would then using their memories and notes of the day, and also the trial transcript to check, would write these
Oh no,
vivid
I know
long.
that
Yeah,
these newspapers were very
right,
famous for being accurate
they were, and also,
in
yeah,
their relaying the
yeah,
details of a case that had been in trial.
yeah, and
So
not only, yeah,
yeah,
and also for you and I as historians, it's also good because they were there,
right.
and they could capture like the
Yes.
dramatic moments with colorful details.
Yeah, I've been
And
told
this,
that by the superior court says, "Oh, we don't have that trial transcript, but if you go to the newspaper, they're really accurate
they're very
during
accurate. Yeah,
that period of
yeah,
time."
yeah.
So
So that was good.
I don't doubt that you got the right information. It just struck me so
Yeah.
weird
So
that he
yeah,
would say, "Oh, we should be able to bring this evidence that Bram was going
yeah,
to kill a captain and take over a ship because it was allowed in the Lizzie Borden trial when it wasn't." So I'm
yeah,
just
yeah. So
surprised.
for me, that was there, and according to the reportage, that nothing was made
No,
of
nothing was
that.
made of
Yeah,
it. No,
yeah,
but it wasn't allowed. So
yeah, yeah,
also, it wasn't allowed in this case to have that information brought. It was too prejudicial, and it
yeah,
also was too far away in time
yeah.
for it to be effective argument by the
Mhm.
prosecution. Now, this is interesting in that the both the Lizzie Borden case and the Herbert Fuller case, in both cases, a husband and wife are killed with a bladed instrument. And
Yes,
while in this case, both of them may have been asleep, in the Borden case, at least one of them had been asleep.
yes.
No weapon is found, right? There's
Uh-huh.
no blood stains on anybody.
And they're both axe murders.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, really a hatchet in the Borden case, but
Want to be technical about it?
yeah, poison figures
Okay.
into the case, right?
Sure. Yeah.
Lizzie supposedly went to try to find poison, but it's
Yes.
not allowed
Yeah.
in trial. And then Brahm says that the liquor that he drank was poisoned.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
There's religious activities of the defendant. So you have,
Yep.
Lizzie being a God-fearing Sunday school teacher, and then
Mhm.
you have Brahm who is preaches, and
Mhm.
it was a part of this organization that he worked for a man who it was a religious restaurant in a way
Yeah,
where
it
people
was.
would
Yeah.
go
Yeah.
and get food and then
Yes,
hear the
that's
word of
right. Yes.
God, and he was
Mhm.
a part of that, so he was religious.
Oh,
And
very
so
religious. Yeah.
But both cases are what we call a locked door mystery. So
Hmm.
very small number of suspects
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
possible to commit the crime.
Yeah.
In the case, it would have been Lizzie or the maid or
Uh-huh.
some outside person, some ne'er-do-well. And
Yeah.
then you have in the Bram case, in the Herbert Fuller case, it's the same way. It has to be somebody on the boat. It has to
Oh,
be
of
one of
course,
those
no, it is. No, there's no question. Yeah. That's what
somebody
makes it
on that
that's what
boat
makes it
did that.
so bizarre. That's what makes it so bizarre. Yeah.
Right. And then you've got Brom going, well, we should throw this away, right? We should throw this
Yeah.
axe away because
Looks
somebody's going to
terrible.
use it against us. And they're like, okay. And he throws it off. And then Fencer goes,
Spencer.
no, you shouldn't have done that. And
Yeah.
then Brom is like, no, we got to clean up the
Yeah.
crime scene. And Spencer's like, no, you're going to leave
Yeah.
it alone. And
Yeah.
Brom's like, we're going to throw the bodies overboard. He's like, no, you're not going to throw
Right.
the
Yes,
bodies
that's right. Yeah.
overboard. We got
Yeah.
to keep them so that they are evidence. And that, so you've got people who are not
Mhm.
educated, who understand crime scenes, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And Brom is just like, oh, I'm so afraid. He was so afraid. He was crying and he was so miserable. And
Yep.
it's, I guess his behavior after seemed to indicate a consciousness of guilt because he was crying. And the same thing with Lizzie. Her behavior of not crying indicated a consciousness of guilt because the police looked at her and said, well, she's not really upset. So
Uh-huh.
it's weird how a woman who doesn't show her feelings and then a man who does have this,
Very, yeah. Very
very,
interesting. Yeah. Yeah.
very
Yes.
different effect on men,
Yes.
policemen, and judges and defense attorneys and prosecuting attorneys who are judging them based on their behavior and other men.
Yes.
So it's all in Massachusetts. It's what,
Yeah. So, yeah.
1896, which is, 3 years after the Borden trial. So it's all still fresh in people's minds. I thought it was just a kind of a unique parallel story that, of course, took place on the high seas, but was an interesting collection of possibilities. And yet it had to be one of these people.
It has to be. Yep, absolutely. It's the Murder on the Orient Express is the more modern.
Exactly. It's an Agatha Christie story.
That's right.
It is a Sherlock Holmes story, right?
Yeah,
One of
is.
these people is guilty. Yeah.
Yeah.
So you really feel that Charlie Brown wasn't looked at very carefully. What about his background makes you think that he's capable of this kind of crime?
He had a history in Boston. He had a history. So sailors were led very transitory lives. They'd be on a ship and they'd have a contract, and then when the ship entered port, they'd be let go, and then they'd be like a boarding houses, and then try to find another job, and so very transitory. So he was in Boston. I'm not very long, having been discharged from one job, and in a boarding house, mate or roommate recalled that he was very paranoid and perhaps drank and was a very strange fellow.
He would talk to himself and stuff on the ship, right?
He did talk to himself on the ship, and at one point it looked like he was trying to jump overboard after the murders were discovered. Very odd. He had talked about, while on the ship, some days before the murder, how easy it would be to set the ship on fire, based upon where he knew kerosene was being stored. But the big one was during the trial, Bram's defense team learned that Charlie Brown had been psychiatrically hospitalized in Amsterdam some years before for drinking, becoming paranoid, and trying to shoot somebody, and was hospitalized, put into an asylum, but no charges were filed due to temporary insanity. And Hort knew this, and was keeping it from the defense. And the defense, which is, you're not supposed to do that, right? The prosecution needs to share. Hort reversed himself and came up with, he coached Brown. This is where he put Brown for one night in solitary confinement, because he wanted to get Brown to come up with a plausible explanation of what was going on that would cause him to try to shoot
But he
somebody.
lied on the stand too
Oh,
about
he
it
did. Oh,
all,
all the
and
time. Yeah.
Cotter accused him of perjury in the
Oh, he did. Yeah,
trial. Yeah.
Carter and French they were attack dogs. This is why I could discount any suggestion that Monks had anything to do with it, because French and Carter, they went after him, and so they ridiculed his spelling. They
This is
doubted.
Monks, right?
Yeah,
Right.
exactly. So I think Carter has a good quote where he gets Monks on the stand, and this is interesting. In the old days, you actually stood, you didn't sit.
Right. In
So if you were
Massachusetts, especially.
testifying,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
stood for 6 hours.
Mhm.
And so he gets Monks on the stand, and Carter's sort of his opening statement is, it's been suggested here, Mr. Monks, that you went to Harvard. I mean, that's a cutting remark,
Yeah. But
So again, I don't.
they
I just.
accused Charlie Brown of being a perjurer, and
Oh yeah,
brought evidence that he was, and
yeah,
actually like got attaché for Holland, right?
yeah.
Diplomatic missives about the truth of what happened in Amsterdam, and how he lied about it. And then it turned out that Charlie Brown was this massive liar about almost everything. And
Everything, yeah,
he told different stories to different people.
yeah.
But he said, I'm just a
And he changed
sailor.
he changed his name all the
That's
time. He
what you do.
changed
You
his name.
make up yarns on a boat,
Yeah,
you don't
yeah,
tell
yeah,
anybody the truth. That's
yeah.
just
No,
the way
definitely
the
so. Yeah,
lifestyle is.
yeah.
And in some sense, well, that sort of makes a little sense,
Mhm,
you just, your life may be really boring, and so
mhm,
make it more
mhm,
interesting. But
yeah,
this is something he admitted to certain people that he had killed somebody,
yeah.
and because he couldn't remember that he didn't.
Yeah, no,
And
no, I don't. Yeah, I think there's kind of no doubt that he did, and we're not going to get into this now. But there was a whole thing about if Brown was at the wheel at the time and claimed that he would not have been able to leave the wheel for the minute it would take to kill all these people, the 2 or 3 minutes. And that was a huge thing, and it was really proven that a person actually could leave the wheel.
tie it up,
Yeah,
right?
put it in what they called brackets. So we're not gonna get into that. That's the whole thing. But Brown had very easy access to the after house. But one other thing about Carter and French and how they went after Monks is they outright accused him of complete cowardice. That he heard the scream and his first
Right.
reaction was to get his revolver and go on deck and not see, well, is Mrs. Nash okay? So they really.
It's really interesting. All of this stuff that you've talked about is so interesting. We've been speaking to C. Michael Hiam, author of Murder Aboard, The Herbert Fuller Tragedy, and the Ordeal of Thomas Bram, a fascinating look at a maritime mystery that, for the moment, even crossed paths with the Lizzie Borden case. It's a powerful reminder of how these trials, separated by only a few years, shape not just public opinion, but the evolving idea of what counts as proof in modern American law. If you'd like to learn more about Michael's work, you can find Murder Aboard wherever books are sold, along with his earlier titles, Dirigible Dreams, A Monument to Deceit, and Eddie Shore and That Old Time Hockey. Thanks for listening to the Lizzie Borden podcast. And thank you, Michael, very much for this enlightening conversation.
Well, thank you for having me.
You're very welcome. Bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Lizzie Borden Podcast, episode 39.
The Lizzie Borden Podcast is sponsored by Belanger Books, featuring all new adventures of Sherlock Holmes, Solar Ponds, Carnacki the Ghost Finder, and occult detectives from the pulp era to the 21st century. From Lovecraftian horror to the wondrous worlds of H.G. Wells, Belanger Books has it all. Visit them today at belangerbooks.com.
We've been speaking with Dr. C. Michael Hiam, author of Murder Aboard, The Herbert Fuller Tragedy and the Ordeal of Thomas Bram, a gripping new work of historical true crime. Find Richard Barron's Lizzie Borden Girl Detective stories at Amazon.com and at LizzieBordenGirlDetective.com, where you can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Listen to more Lizzie Borden podcasts on our website or on Podbeam, Audible, Google Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube. Please support this podcast through a subscription on Patreon. Thank you.